All right. Hi, everyone. This lecture is going to be on functional training. It's a terminology that many of you heard before. And so the purpose of this short lecture is just to go over it to make sure you actually understand what we mean when we say functional training. So functional training isn't going to be a replacement for all of your training, right? It still means that you're going to need some cardiovascular programming, some complementary resistance programming, and sometimes, some other types of programming, right? It's a complement to those types of training, but it's certainly used a lot in our field as kind of what we call prehab or pre-rehabilitation. So essentially, if we want to make sure that people are limiting their likelihood of getting hurt, functional training is a good thing to include in our interventions or our training for our clients. Okay? So let's go ahead and define what functional training is. It often occurs in a closed kinetic chain. So when you see CKC, that stands for closed kinetic chain. And essentially a closed kinetic chain happens in any movement where you have the distal aspect, so whether your hands or your arms or your legs, so your distal extremity is fixed to an object that is stationary. So for example, a squat is a closed kinetic chain exercise because your feet, which is an extremity, is in contact with the ground. A leg extension is an open kinetic chain exercise, right? Because your feet are not connected to anything, right? So that lower extremity or aspect of the extremity is not in contact with something that's stationary. Really important that you understand the difference between closed kinetic chain exercises and open kinetic chain exercises. When we talk about functional training, we are really talking about closed kinetic chain exercises. And you can imagine why. When you compare a squat versus a leg extension, the squat is much more functional because in addition to having that contact with the ground, you're all of a sudden going to start using multiple joints rather than one joint. And that kind of leads you to that next point here, okay? So it's a movement at any one joint in the kinetic chain requires motion as well at the other joints in the kinetic chain. So again, a closed kinetic chain exercise, let's use the squat. When you squat, you are going to use multiple joints, okay? So you're using your ankle joint, you're using your hip joint, and you're using your knee joint, okay? You're bending all joints, but it requires you to use more muscles. If you're doing an open kinetic chain exercise, again, let's use the leg extension, okay? The only joint that's really moving during a leg extension is the knee. And so as a result of that, you're going to utilize less musculature, okay? So again, I have some examples here. Push-ups and squats are good multi-joint exercises that are also closed kinetic chain exercises. And when we think about our functional training, what we really want to separate ourselves from and not do is we want to avoid saying, oh, we're going to work biceps, triceps, chest, and back. Okay, that's a very traditional way of training, and it's not functional in nature. Functional training is all about training movement. I have to say that again. Functional training is all about training movement and movement patterns, not muscle groups. Okay, that is a huge difference in functional training versus kind of your traditional training methods. And functional training, like we said earlier, involves multiple joints in multiple planes. Okay, so when we think about functional training, squats are great, but squats with rotation are even better because now you're using multiple planes. So we know that functional training are exercises that teach a client to handle their own body weight first, and then we progress by adding some more things that are difficult. So functional training, because it is multi-joint and multi-planar, requires a client to be working a lot harder than they're used to working because they're used to doing kind of some of the open chain exercises. So when we start to introduce functional training to our clients, it's really important that we start with body weight and then we progress. Okay, and here's some ways that you can actually progress. You can progress by adding resistance. You can progress by adding unstable surfaces, so that can be things like Bosu balls or Eric's pads. You can progress by changing the lever arm. And if you remember what that means, a lever arm is the distance between that joint and then that push force, right? So if you're doing a push-up, you're going to have a shorter lever arm if your knees are on the ground than if you have your feet on the ground. Okay, and that kind of just makes sense. And the longer that lever arm, the harder it's going to be. You can also progress your functional training by adding some sort of balance component or doing kind of single or one arm or one leg type stuff. Let's go ahead and look at what functional training is not. Functional training is not machine-based, and the leg extension example is a great example, right? Because when you do a leg extension, you're only doing open kinetic exercises because you don't have that distal extremity that's attached to anything, and it's single joint. Okay, so machines are applying force in a kind of already guided, pre-guided motion, while the body is being supported. So if you look at all of these different pictures, you can see that, right? So the adductor machine, the bench press, the back extension, the hamstring curl, the abdominal crunch. Yes, you're going to be focusing on that singular muscle, but you're all of a sudden, because of this, losing all the other muscle groups from being incorporated into that movement pattern. So functional training is certainly not machine-based because you don't have the ability to be multiplanar and multi-joint. It is definitely not muscle isolation training, and it's not single planar or single joint training, okay? Let's go ahead and pause here, and the next video is going to be on postural considerations.